It is absolutely incredible, and when you need to wind on the power, it just comes on so strong. It's like face melting power.
I say that platform, the biggest downfall on that platform is the stock motor.
Stock motor.
Yeah, like the stock motor is very weak.
When we first saw them for the first time, we thought there's no way these things are going to make power because they're just dinky, but we still haven't had huge issues with them.
And by the way, he's saying that he's not seeing problems until they're north of 40, 60 pounds of boost.
Holy moly.
Vorsprung durch Technik, progress through technology. This is the mantra of Audi's Motorsports division. This is fitting as on March 5th, 2009 at the Geneva Auto Show, Audi released the first ever TT-RS. Under the hood of this pocket rocket was the EA855 Evo. While Audi described this 5-cylinder as an all-new engine, the truth was this engine was an evolution of the previously Western Hemisphere exclusive 07K. While both engines share many parts, the Evo features an aluminum engine block, direct injection, and turbocharging. All of these advancements converged to produce one of Audi's most performant engines in modern history. While being very unconventional in design, this engine is quickly becoming a favorite of the car community.
The Audi Daza is truly unlike any other engine that's available on the market right now. The Daza is an inline 5-cylinder, and just based on having an odd number of cylinders, the Daza has truly cemented itself as a notable engine. But once you start to look below the surface, you'll start to see that simply celebrating that this engine has 5 cylinders is actually just a massive distraction from the supercar engineering that went into this engine. Now, before we get too deep into this video, we need to establish what is a Daza and where did it come from. Typically when I make these videos, I try not to repeat myself too much, but I'm gonna make an exception here because according to the YouTube algorithm, the last video that I made was on a subject that car guys aren't really interested in, so there's a big chance that you guys actually didn't hear me say this last time because, well, nobody watched that video. So like I said in the LS video, the car community has a habit of giving car parts and even entire engines nicknames. And the Audi Daza is a perfect example of this. The actual name of the Volkswagen 5-cylinder is the EA855, and just like most other manufacturers, VW made a ton of variations of this engine depending on what chassis it was going into. Now, how VW labels these variants is by using a prefix code followed by either a 3 or 4-digit ID code. Most people in the car community use the prefix code of 07K when referring to the naturally aspirated EA855. And then when referring to the turbocharged EA855 Evo, most people use the name Daza, even though this engine is also an 07K. The EA855 Evo has about 7 different ID codes, but the most widely known engine ID code is DAZA, or as the car community calls it, Daza. So just for clarity, on my channel going forward, whenever I use the name 07K, I'm referring to the naturally aspirated variants of the EA855, and then when I use the name Daza, I'm referring to the turbocharged versions, or the EA855 Evo. Now, when trying to figure out where the design of the Daza comes from, you'll hear a lot of people say things like this.
Powering this Volkswagen is a 2.5-litre inline 5-cylinder engine that makes around 400 horsepower. You get the V10 engine out of a Lamborghini Huracan or an Audi R8 V10, you cut it in half, and that is exactly what is in the engine bay of that little mini supercar.
Now, I absolutely love Mighty Car Mods. It's one of my favorite channels on YouTube. So if you are a car guy, go subscribe to their channel. These guys are legit. But even though I do love Marty and Moog's channel, I think Moog might be wrong here. So let's look at the evidence and try to figure out where this engine comes from. So our first line of evidence is, well, the name. The Daza, like I said, is actually named the EA855 Evo. And that's because it's an evolution of the naturally aspirated EA855. So if this engine was some type of variant of the Lamborghini Huracan's engine, Volkswagen would have reflected that in the name of the engine. Secondly, if you look at the design of the Daza and the Huracan's engine, there are some similarities, but there are a lot of differences as well. The most significant differences are in the bottom end of the engine. If you were to literally just cut a Huracan's engine in half, the engine that you would come up with would be dimensionally different from the Daza. And that's because the Daza and the Lamborghini Huracan do not share the same bore spacing. So why is that the case? Well, I think this is where a lot of the confusion comes in, because I think a lot of people have forgotten or just simply don't really know where the heritage of the Lamborghini V10 comes from. Now, I'm sure most of you guys are aware that the Lamborghini Huracan and its predecessor, the Lamborghini Gallardo, both of these engines have a 5.2 liter V10 engine. This engine's also shared with a few different Audi models as well. But I think what a lot of people forget is that the Gallardo started life with a 5 liter V10 before the 5.2 was introduced. And the misconception that I commonly see is that people think that when it was time to make the 5.2, Lamborghini just simply took the 5 liter and just made it slightly larger. And that's actually not the case. The 5 liter Lamborghini engine appears to have been developed by Lamborghini without too much influence from Audi. And then in 2008, when the Gallardo got a facelift, which also coincided with the launch of the Audi R8, the Gallardo got an all-new 5.2 liter V10 that was not based on the 5 liter V10. So as a result, these are completely different engines, and in fact, if you listen to these two engines back to back, you can actually tell a notable difference in how these engines sound. And we actually have concrete evidence that the 5.2 liter V10 is not related to that original 5 liter V10. Because if you look in Volkswagen's own service manuals for the 5.2 liter V10s, they say that this engine was developed from the architecture of the 4.2 liter V8. Which is why all of the 5.2 liter V10s and all of the 4.2 liter V8s share the same bore, stroke, and bore centers. It's because they all come from the same developmental pipeline.
I think a lot of it is urban legend on what people sort of think is Lambo engine. I've got Gallardos out there, they've got Audi castings on them, but we were discussing this off camera. You know, it's like the old days when Rovers used to have Honda engines in. So I think it's when the relationship started and when it became an Audi Lamborghini engine. For me, LP560, that was the first one to have an R8 engine in, or the R8 had the Lamborghini engine in, whichever way you want to look at it. For me, it's an R8 engine in a Lamborghini, in an LP, because it was made in Neckarsalem, which is an Audi factory. So that's how I see it. The 5 litre, that sits on its own. Nothing else has it. Nothing else uses it. That is just in 5 litre Gallardo.
Now, if we get back to the 07K and the Daza, when you start to look at the design and the architecture of those engine blocks, you'll start to notice that they are most similar to the original 5 liter V10 from the 2003 Lamborghini Gallardo. All of these engines have the same exact bore, stroke, and bore spacing. And then when you look at the valve train, the cylinder head of the naturally aspirated 07K is incredibly similar to the original 5 liter Gallardo V10, and the cylinder head on the Daza is incredibly similar to the current cylinder head on the Lamborghini Huracan. So at the end of the day, I don't think we can fully say that the Daza is literally half of the Huracan engine, but honestly, I don't think that's a bad thing. When you look at the Daza, its engineering doesn't seem to just be a copy and paste of the Huracan's engine. The Daza actually looks more like a collection of all of the engineering that went into the various Lamborghini V10s, and arguably to me, that's a lot cooler than just cutting the Huracan's engine in half, because to me, that means it's fair to say that the Daza is the most highly evolved version of that original 5 liter V10 platform. And it's just insane that you can get all of that engineering in just an admittedly normal compact sedan like the RS3. When looking at the construction of the Daza, this is a 5-cylinder engine with an aluminum block and spray-on cylinder liners, although some early models of this engine had cast iron blocks. This engine has a forged crankshaft and forged rods, 4 valves per cylinder, variable valve timing on both intake and exhaust, and variable valve lift on the exhaust camshafts. This engine also features direct and port injection and turbocharging. Overall, this engine features tons of technology that your average car guy would not have access to just on one complete engine anywhere else. But just because the Daza is packed with exotic supercar technology, that doesn't mean that Audi has created an unreliable, drama-filled ownership experience.
Not if I have anything to say about it, and I do.
Alright, so pretty much every time I make a video about an Audi product, you guys complain about how I say Audi. Get over it. That's all. Like I said before, the Daza is actually based on the Volkswagen 07K, and as someone who currently owns 3 Volkswagen products, I typically stay away from using the words reliability and Volkswagen together. But the naturally aspirated 07K is probably one of the most reliable, trouble-free engines that Volkswagen has ever produced, and the Daza being an evolution of the 07K inherits a lot of that dependability. The most common issues that Daza owners talk about are leaks. Rather if that's the water pump or the oil pan having some drippage, those are pretty much your big issues. It is worth noting though that early TTRS engines, so we're talking about from 2009 to about 2014, these engines can suffer from carbon buildup issues, and that's because these early engines only had direct injection. They did not have port injection as well. At the end of the day, if you can find an Audi with a Daza motor, and if you keep up with the maintenance, this engine's going to treat you very well. But that's kind of leads us to the biggest problem with the Daza, finding one. Kinda like the S54 from a previous episode of Power Rankings, the Daza is a highly specialized piece of engineering, and as a result, this engine was only used in the top trim levels of a handful of models. As a car enthusiast, the easiest way to access one of these engines is to just buy a car that came with one from the factory. But as you guys can see, not really a whole lot of cars came equipped with this engine. And while the Daza may be limited in terms of mass market availability, the Daza's access to aftermarket parts and upgradability is pretty near unlimited. The Daza is a modern direct injected turbocharged engine, so the TikTok special is super effective on this platform. With a downpipe and a tune, you can easily add 50 horsepower and 120 torque to your Daza. And if you're willing to add bigger port injectors, so going up to 1000cc injectors, a flex fuel kit, and a hybrid turbo, you can easily reach up to 700 horsepower from this tiny 5-cylinder. And if you really have the need for excessive displays of power, IROS Motorsports has everything that you need to raise your RS3 or your TTRS to quadruple digit horsepower ranges. The only problem that I see with the Daza's aftermarket game is that it's still kind of rare to see this engine swapped into other chassis. Now I know that there's probably a whole bunch of people already in the comments talking about that they've seen this engine swapped into all different types of cars, but typically those types of swaps are almost always in a car that shares a chassis with the RS3. So I'm talking about cars like the Golf or the Tiguan. Basically cars are on the VW MQB platform. Where I would really like to see things go with the Daza is by having options to swap this engine into other cars like the Miata, BMWs, or even longitudinal Audis. The Daza's aftermarket also lacks support for most mainstream aftermarket ECUs. Like I mentioned in the N54 video, most aftermarket ECUs do not support direct injection, but hopefully that will be something that we'll see change in the future. But until these holes are covered up, I can't really rate the Daza as highly as I do engines like the LS, the Coyote, or the Honda K-Series quite yet. The other area where the Daza struggles, well, at least in my view, is when it comes to overall value. So if you're doing basic bolt-on, so talking about things like turbo inlet, a downpipe, and a tune, prices are pretty average, and the horsepower returns get out of control quite quickly. And the more aftermarket parts that you put on your Daza, the more you get out of it. So the problem isn't really the horsepower to dollar return of the Daza. The problem I have is when it comes to getting the engine itself. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, just like a lot of other European engines, the best way to get a Daza is to just buy a car that came with one from the factory. But unlike the N54, where BMW basically just put that engine in everything, the Daza had a very limited release. And like I mentioned before, the Daza was only available in the most expensive trim level of a handful of options. So if you've decided that you just want to buy a complete dropout engine, prepare to have your wallet lightened. These engines are just obscenely expensive, almost to the point where I would describe getting a Daza dropout motor as prohibitively expensive. If you're just looking to get the engine itself, your best option is going to be to look for a crash donor car. Or another viable option is to buy a VW 07K. Like I mentioned before, the Daza is an evolution of the 07K, and as a result, a lot of parts are interchangeable. So if you're a price-conscious car enthusiast and you're not really afraid of building an engine from the ground up, a VW 07K is probably the way that you will want to go. Alright, so before I give my final verdict, I just wanted to point out that there's a new addition to the engine scoring that you guys typically see in this section, and it actually comes from you guys. I'm adding a viewer score, and it's completely based on how many likes that you guys drop on a video. So if the Daza is your favorite engine and you want to see it at the top of the scorecard, drop a like on this video. And then when I go to make future episodes of Power Rankings, right before I go to release it, I'm going to come back and check all of the videos, look at the likes, and then update the scorecards for you guys. But in terms of my personal opinions, where does the Daza rank on my is it worth it scale? Well, from a design perspective, the Daza oozes character. The fact that your average car enthusiast can have access to Lamborghini technology is just absolutely bananas. In stock form, these motors make a tremendous amount of horsepower, and I know every time I say something like this, you guys freak out and like to tell me that 400 horsepower is not a lot of horsepower. But let's just put this into perspective. The current RS3 right now has 97% of the horsepower that the original V8 powered Audi R8 had, and it has 11% more torque, all coming from a 2.5 liter engine in something that's the size of a Jetta. You really just can't exaggerate how impressive this engine is. Architecturally, there really are no downsides to this engine. The biggest problem with the Daza is, well, its limited release. But if you're in the market for a TTRS or an RS3, the Daza has serious potential to become one of your new favorite engines.